Breaking tonight, a strategic framework that has been quietly reshaping the Middle East for years is now coming into sharper focus, and what analysts are seeing may signal one of the most consequential partnerships of the 21st century. It is not a headline, it is not a declaration of war, but it is a 25-year economic and security cooperation agreement between Beijing and Tehran that, if fully implemented, could redraw the balance of power across Asia and the Persian Gulf in ways that military planners in Washington, Tel Aviv, and beyond may be forced to rethink. The document itself has been public since 2021. Yet the full scope of what it represents is only now beginning to crystallize in the minds of strategists who study the long arc of great power competition. This is not about a secret treaty signed in darkness. This is about what happens when two powers facing parallel strategic pressures decide that their futures may be better secured together than apart, and what that decision could mean for everyone else. The agreement itself is wide-ranging. It covers everything from energy and infrastructure to banking, telecommunications, and military cooperation. China would receive discounted oil and gas from Iran over the coming decades. Iran would receive massive Chinese investment in its roads, railways, ports, and industrial base. The two nations would deepen their collaboration in cybersecurity, intelligence sharing, and what the document describes as law enforcement and domestic security coordination. On paper, it reads like a standard development partnership, but in the context of the broader geopolitical chessboard, it may be far more than that. For China, Iran sits at the crossroads of the Belt and Road Initiative, the land bridge connecting Central Asia to the Middle East, and the maritime choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly one-fifth of global oil shipments pass every day. For Iran, China represents a lifeline against American sanctions, a market too large for Washington to isolate, and a military partner with technology and capital that Tehran cannot generate on its own. The alignment is logical, the timing is dangerous, and the implications could be enormous. What makes this framework so unsettling to Western analysts is not what it explicitly promises, but what it makes possible. A China that is willing to underwrite Iran's economic survival despite American pressure is a China that has decided the US-led order in the Middle East is no longer legitimate in its eyes. An Iran that is willing to grant China preferential access to its energy reserves, its ports, and potentially its military facilities, is an Iran that may be calculating it no longer needs to fear American isolation. Together, they are constructing what some strategists describe as a parallel economic and security architecture, one that runs alongside the American-led system without depending on it. And if this scenario unfolds over the full 25-year timeline, the regional balance could shift in ways that are difficult to reverse. Consider the energy dimension first. Iran possesses some of the largest proven oil and gas reserves on Earth, yet years of sanctions have choked its export capacity and crippled its infrastructure. China is now the world's largest energy importer, and its dependence on seaborne oil transiting vulnerable choke points is a strategic vulnerability that keeps military planners in Beijing awake at night. A long-term supply agreement with Iran, potentially priced outside the dollar system and settled through alternative financial channels, addresses both problems simultaneously. Iran gets revenue, China gets energy security that does not pass through American naval dominance. And both nations get a partnership that weakens the leverage of sanctions, the primary tool Washington has used for decades to shape behavior in Tehran. If this economic integration deepens, the question is not whether Iran will survive American pressure. The question is whether American pressure will still matter in 10 years. But the strategic risk extends far beyond oil. The infrastructure investments China is making or may make in Iran are not neutral. A modernized port at Chabahar or Bandar Abbas, expanded with Chinese capital and engineering, could serve dual purposes: commercial shipping by day, military logistics by night. Railways connecting Iran to Central Asia and beyond could move more than goods. They could move influence. And the telecommunications and cybersecurity cooperation outlined in the agreement raises concerns that are harder to quantify but no less serious. A Chinese-built digital backbone in Iran is not merely an economic project. It is a potential window into Iranian communications, intelligence, and surveillance capabilities, and a foothold for Beijing in a region where American signals intelligence has long operated with relative freedom. If Chinese firms are designing Iran's 5G networks, its satellite systems, and its cyber defenses, then the information architecture of one of America's most persistent adversaries may increasingly be shaped by its most formidable peer competitor. The military dimension is where analysts become most guarded, and for good reason. The agreement does not explicitly establish a mutual defense pact. It does not create a formal alliance structure comparable to NATO, But it does call for expanded military cooperation, joint exercises, and what both sides describe as counterterrorism collaboration. In practice, this could mean Chinese advisors training Iranian forces. It could mean Iranian officers studying at Chinese military academies. It could mean the transfer of dual-use technology, drone systems, missile components, and electronic warfare tools that fall into gray zones difficult to monitor and even harder to prevent. China has already demonstrated its willingness to sell advanced weapons to American adversaries. Iran has already demonstrated its willingness to use proxy forces, asymmetric tactics, and long-range strike capabilities to reshape the battlefield in its favor. If those two trajectories converge, the result may not be a formal alliance, but something more insidious, a convergence of capabilities that makes both nations harder to deter separately and potentially impossible to contain together. This is why the 25-year timeline matters so much. A quarter century is not a diplomatic gesture. It is a generational bet. It suggests that both Beijing and Tehran are thinking not in terms of the next crisis, but in terms of the next era. For China, it is a hedge against American containment in the Pacific. If Washington is focused on the South China Sea, on Taiwan, on the first island chain, then a deeply embedded Chinese presence in the Middle East forces the United States to look in two directions at once. For Iran, it is a hedge against regime change, against economic collapse, against the possibility that American pressure will eventually succeed in fracturing the Islamic Republic from within. Together they are building what amounts to a strategic rear area for each other, a zone of cooperation so deep that disentangling it may become politically and economically prohibitive long before the 25 years are up. The regional implications are already rippling outward. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel have all watched this partnership with growing alarm, and each has responded in its own way. The Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements between Israel and several Gulf states, were driven in part by a shared fear of Iranian expansion, but they were also driven by a recognition that American security guarantees may no longer be sufficient in a world where China is willing to back Tehran regardless of American objections. The Gulf states have begun hedging their own bets, deepening economic ties with Beijing, even as they maintain security relationships with Washington. Israel has accelerated its military preparations against Iran while simultaneously expanding its own technological and trade partnerships with China. The result is a Middle East that is increasingly multipolar, increasingly unpredictable, and increasingly difficult for any single power to manage. What matters now is the direction of the risk. The 25-year framework is not a finished project. Many of its provisions remain aspirational. The investment targets have not been fully met. The infrastructure projects have faced delays, bureaucratic resistance, and the sheer difficulty of doing business in a sanctions-ravaged economy. But the trajectory is clear. Every year that passes without a fundamental reversal, the economic interdependence deepens. The political alignment hardens. The strategic assumptions that guided American policy in the Middle East for half a century become less relevant, and the possibility of a future crisis, one in which Chinese and Iranian interests are so tightly bound that a conflict with one becomes a confrontation with both, grows more plausible. Analysts fear that the most dangerous scenario is not an overt act of aggression, but a slow, invisible transformation of the regional order. A China that controls critical infrastructure in Iran, that dominates its energy exports, that shapes its military modernization, and that provides a diplomatic shield that the United Nations is a China that has acquired leverage without firing a shot. An Iran that knows it has a great power patron, that can weather sanctions because Beijing will not enforce them, and that can modernize its forces with technology transferred through gray channels, is an Iran that may become far more assertive in its regional ambitions. The combination does not need to produce a formal empire to produce imperial effects. It simply needs to create a zone of influence so dense that other powers cannot operate within it without Chinese and Iranian consent. This may be less about what has happened and more about what could happen next. The agreement is public, the investments are documented, the military cooperation is acknowledged. What is not yet visible is the end state. Will China establish a permanent military presence in the Gulf? Will Iran acquire Chinese missile technology that changes the deterrence calculus for Israel and Saudi Arabia? Will the economic integration become so deep that a war with Iran becomes, by extension, an economic war with China? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that military planners may be forced to answer in the coming years, and the answers may determine whether the 21st century Middle East is shaped by American power, Chinese ambition, or something more volatile than either. The strategic risk is compounded by timing. The United States is undergoing a generational reassessment of its global commitments. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have exhausted American appetite for large-scale Middle East interventions. The pivot to Asia, begun under Obama and continued under successive administrations, reflects a consensus that China's rise in the Pacific is the primary strategic challenge of the era. But that pivot assumes that the Middle East can be managed with a lighter touch, that regional partners can handle local security, and that American energy independence reduces the urgency of Gulf stability. The 25-year framework challenges every one of those assumptions. It suggests that the Middle East is not fading as a strategic theater. It is transforming into a theater where American power is contested not by regional upstarts alone, but by a great power partnership with global reach. If this scenario unfolds, the implications for U.S. force posture could be profound. Aircraft carriers that once operated with relative freedom in the Persian Gulf may face a more complex threat environment, one that includes not just Iranian missiles and swarm boats, but Chinese surveillance systems, Chinese-supplied anti-ship weapons, and potentially Chinese submarines operating from Iranian ports. American bases in the region, already targets for Iranian proxies, may find themselves within range of more sophisticated Chinese design systems, and the logistical networks that sustain U.S. operations, from fuel supplies to ammunition stockpiles, may face new vulnerabilities if Chinese economic influence reshapes regional trade routes and infrastructure priorities. The next Gulf War, if it comes, may look nothing like the last one. The cyber and space dimensions add another layer of uncertainty. Chinese cyber capabilities are among the most advanced in the world. Iranian cyber operations, while less sophisticated, have proven effective against regional targets and have demonstrated a willingness to operate below the threshold of armed conflict. A formalized cooperation framework could accelerate the transfer of Chinese cyber tools and techniques to Iranian operators, or it could simply create a shared doctrine for how to use cyber operations to disrupt American and allied networks in a future crisis. In space, Chinese satellite constellations could provide Iran with imagery, communications, and navigation capabilities that reduce its dependence on Western systems and complicate American efforts to isolate Tehran electronically. The scenario raising fears about a U.S.-China space war is already being discussed in Pacific contexts. Adding Iran to that equation creates a multi-theater challenge that stretches American resources and attention in ways that may be unsustainable. What makes this harder to ignore is the ideological dimension, however muted it may appear on the surface. China is not an Islamic republic. Iran is not a communist state. Their political systems, their religious foundations, and their historical narratives are radically different. But they share a common enemy in the American-led international order, and they share a common ambition to see that order weakened, fragmented, and ultimately replaced by something more favorable to their interests. That is not an alliance of values. It is an alliance of convenience, and in some ways that makes it more durable. It does not depend on shared beliefs. It depends on shared opposition. And as long as the United States remains the dominant power in both the Pacific and the Middle East, that opposition will continue to bind Beijing and Tehran together. The question for American strategists is whether this partnership can be disrupted, and if so, at what cost. Sanctions have clearly not prevented it. Military threats have not deterred it. Diplomatic isolation has not collapsed it. The only tool that might work is time, and time may be on China's side. Every year that Iran remains economically viable despite American pressure, every year that Chinese investment deepens Iranian dependence on Beijing, every year that the regional order shifts further toward multipolarity, the harder it becomes to reverse the trend. Some analysts argue that the United States should accept a diminished role in the Middle East and focus its resources on the Pacific, where China's rise is most directly threatening. Others argue that abandoning the Gulf to Chinese influence would cede control of global energy markets and create a strategic vulnerability that no amount of Pacific military power could offset. Neither option is attractive. Both may be necessary. For Israel, the calculus is even more stark. A nuclear-capable Iran is already an existential concern. A nuclear-capable Iran backed by Chinese economic power, Chinese military technology, and Chinese diplomatic cover at the United Nations is a fundamentally different threat. It changes the deterrence equation, it changes the timeline for Israeli decision-making, and it changes the range of options available to Israeli military planners, who may conclude that the window for preventative action is closing faster than previously assumed. The scenario in which Israel faces a multi-front missile saturation scenario becomes far more dangerous if the missiles are more accurate, more numerous, and more difficult to intercept because of Chinese-supplied guidance systems and countermeasures. The strategic shock of discovering that Iranian capabilities have advanced further than intelligence estimated is a risk that keeps Israeli defense officials awake at night. For the Gulf Arab states, the 25-year framework forces a choice that none of them want to make. They have built their security on American guarantees and their prosperity on global trade, but they have also built their futures on Chinese markets, Chinese technology, and Chinese infrastructure. If forced to choose between Washington and Beijing, most would prefer not to. But if the choice is imposed by a crisis, by a conflict in which Chinese and Iranian interests align against American and Israeli interests, the Gulf states may find themselves in an impossible position. Their oil flows east as much as west. Their ports are increasingly Chinese-built. Their telecommunications networks are increasingly Chinese-designed. The leverage that once allowed the United States to shape Gulf behavior through security partnerships may be eroding, and the erosion may be irreversible. This is why the 25-year framework is not merely a bilateral agreement. It is a stress test for the entire American-led order in the Middle East. It asks whether that order can adapt to a world in which China is not just a trading partner, but a strategic competitor, in which Iran is not just a regional troublemaker, but a node in a larger anti-American network, and in which the tools of American power, economic, military, and diplomatic, are no longer sufficient to maintain the status quo. The answers to those questions will not be determined by the text of the agreement itself. They will be determined by what happens in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next crisis, and there will be crises. The Middle East does not remain stable for long. Whether it is an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, an Iranian proxy attack on a Saudi oil installation, a naval confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, or a cyber operation that disrupts global energy markets, the next flashpoint is never far away. What the 25-year framework does is change the context in which those crises unfold. It introduces a great power dimension into regional conflicts that have historically been contained, however imperfectly, by American dominance. It creates the possibility that a local war could escalate into a broader confrontation, not because Beijing or Washington wants it, but because their respective commitments to regional partners drag them into a conflict neither can control. This may be the clearest warning sign yet that the post-Cold War era in the Middle East is ending. The American unipolar moment, if it ever truly existed in the Gulf, is fading. In its place is emerging a more competitive, more dangerous, more unpredictable environment in which multiple great powers pursue conflicting interests through local proxies, economic leverage, and military positioning. The 25-year China-Iran framework is not the cause of this transformation. It is a symptom and an accelerator. It reflects a world in which American power is no longer assumed, in which alternative centers of gravity are actively competing for influence, and in which the old rules of regional order no longer apply. What matters now is whether the United States and its allies recognize the scale of the challenge and respond accordingly, not with panic, not with premature military action, but with a clear-eyed assessment of what is changing, what is at risk, and what can still be done to shape the outcome. The 25-year timeline is long, but it is not infinite. There are still points of leverage. There are still regional actors who prefer an American-led order to a Chinese-dominated one. There are still economic, technological, and military advantages that the United States possesses and that China cannot easily replicate. The question is whether those advantages will be used before they erode, or whether the window for effective action will close while Washington is still debating what the problem is. One possible chain of events is that the partnership deepens quietly, invisibly, year by year, until the moment of crisis arrives and the United States discovers that its position in the Middle East has been hollowed out from within. Another possible outcome is that the partnership faces internal strains, that Iranian nationalism resents Chinese economic dominance, that Chinese caution prevents the full military commitment Tehran might desire, and that the framework remains more aspirational than operational. Both outcomes are plausible. Neither is predetermined, but the direction of travel is clear, and the strategic risk is real. If this scenario unfolds, the implications could reshape not just the Middle East, but the global balance of power. A China that controls the energy arteries of the Persian Gulf, that maintains military access in Iran, and that has neutralized American sanctions as a tool of statecraft, is a China that has fundamentally altered the terms of great power competition. An Iran that has survived decades of pressure, modernized its forces, and embedded itself in a Chinese-led economic zone, is an Iran that may be far more capable of projecting power, resisting isolation, and shaping regional outcomes than any of its adversaries anticipated. The combination does not guarantee conflict, but it guarantees that the next conflict, if and when it comes, will be fought under conditions that are less favorable to the United States and its allies than at any point since the end of the Cold War. This is the scenario that military planners can no longer ignore. It is not a secret deal hidden in the shadows. It is a public framework, openly acknowledged, steadily implemented, and strategically transformative. The 25 years are not a countdown to some predetermined catastrophe. They are a window of time in which the Middle East may be restructured, in which American influence may be challenged, and in which the rules of the game may be rewritten by powers that do not share Washington's interests or values. The question is not whether this will happen. The question is whether those who have the most to lose will act before it is too late. Tonight, as you watch this, the agreement is still in effect. The investments are still flowing. The partnership is still deepening. And the strategic landscape of the Middle East is still shifting, slowly, inexorably, toward a future that may look very different from the past. What that future holds is not yet written. But the ink is dry on the first draft, and the authors are not American. What happens next may depend on whether anyone else is still reading closely enough to turn the page.